Good afternoon. I was told to start unless people won't have a strong motivation to come in. So I should think saying the most important things afterwards, but I really wanted to start with a observation that media capture is never limited to one country, and autocrats always export their model. They do it for free. And they also, like whenever there is a complete capture of the media, it's inspirational to other autocrats as well. Very good example for that is the Visegrad region, which we are talking about Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia, where we can see developments that have really speeded up. And but we can also include the whole block of post-communist countries. What Viktor Orbán has done to the free press, it has a very strong demoralizing effect across Europe, because actually it sends out the signal that the European community is unable to protect one of its fundamental values. And that's why it's such a serious issue, and we really have to say that press freedom in Europe will be just as strong as it is in its most autocratic country, which is, let's measure press freedom in Europe through Hungary. Orbán now tries to unite the Visegrad countries, and his justice minister is starting an initiative to debate alternative definitions of the rule of law and free press, which is suggesting that there should be a different definition for the rule of law and the free press in Hungary, Poland, and a different one in, let's say, Norway or Finland. And disregarding the fact that the definitions of the press freedom and the rule of law doesn't depend on if you are a conservative or a liberal. There is just one definition. And of course, our discussion will be much more than just agonizing over Orbán or crying over him, because there are many other issues. And we have here our colleague from Bulgaria, and we just spoke that Bulgaria somehow keep escaping the radar of many press freedom watchers, and I am very curious to hear her take why is it so and what is happening in Bulgaria. So with my valued colleagues, we will bring an overview of the limitations of press in our countries, and I would start with Márton Gergely, who is the editor-in-chief of HVG, which is Hungary's biggest independent magazine. And I would like Márton to describe what is the situation of media in Hungary now ahead of the elections, and how the long-term limitations of press freedom play out now when you, Márton, have to report and you have to connect with your audience and explain issues.
So the long Hungarian elections start actually tomorrow with the first primary of the united opposition, and I've been watching the first debate of the five candidates for the prime minister office, and somehow I realized we're going to have the first elections taking place in two entirely different bubbles. Meaning that the oppositional candidates have no more chance to get their message through to every reader, to every voter in the country, that the Orbán government has created a safe space for the Fidesz voters not to hear any arguments of anyone else. It means that the space where the opposition candidates can still tell their side is limited to a smaller part of the population, to those who are not in favor of Orbán. And that means that there is there's an increasingly motion to dramatical speech, to more extreme thoughts, to tell the Hungarian opposition voters that if they are elected prime minister, the first they will do is kick out the constitution of the country with a normal majority, although it would need a supermajority, that on the first day in their office they would see the Attorney General of the country in handcuffs. So they are radicalizing in their speech, and that radicalization, I think, is because they don't even have the chance to get through to those who are in this echo chamber of the Hungarian propaganda. So the last 4 years, we've seen a decline of the diversity of the Hungarian free press. We've seen right after the last elections that the last conservative, free independent media outlets have been closed down, and that Orbán has realized that every small independence of any outlet can be a risk. So he has rearranged the Hungarian propaganda, building up two huge powerhouses, one the public media or the state-owned media, and two, a foundation which unites now 500 different titles. It's called Kesma, and this Kesma is the private leg of the Hungarian state propaganda. So now they have two centralized, huge outlets, which make them easier to be controlled. And those outlets purely echo the side of the Hungarian government. They don't talk to opposition candidates. So, for example, the main newspaper of the Hungarian government, Magyar Nemzet, didn't have an article on the first debate of the 5 opposition candidates. So this is why they simply don't have any chance to get through to tell their view. So why do I say bubble? Because I am working for an independent newspaper. Why are we a bubble? The problem is that at the same time the Hungarian government makes sure that no one talks to us. So we don't get answers by the Hungarian government. There's an ongoing state of emergency since 2015 because of the migration crisis, and since 2019 because of the pandemic. With the pandemic, they have introduced a new possibility for the state institutions to answer journalistic requests within 45 days instead of 15. And then they can ask for an extra 45 days to prepare the answer. That means that they usually answer us 90 days after we had the question. And the other thing is that every state institution has been centralized. So we had the situation where we wanted to go to hospitals and show Hungarian people how dangerous the virus is. We were not reporting on politics. We were not trying to say that Orbán is killing people. We simply wanted to show that the virus does, and why you should protect yourself, why you should vaccinate yourself. But as all hospitals and all schools are centralized, every little school and every little hospital, the workers there have to ask for permission to talk to the press from the ministry itself, and this allowance is never granted. So we are not getting to information firsthand, or we have to bring it with anonymous sources, which discredits the quality of our reporting. So this is how we've been closed away from information, from events, from the possibility to have questions. Yes, our bubble and at the same time has been shrinked. The last 4 years had a real blow to the Hungarian independent journalism, as Index was put under such pressure that 90 colleagues of ours have quitted their job. And a few months ago, Klub Radio was taken off the air as it was not granted its own frequency. To all those really hard things to take, there are always some good side effects.
We will talk about the good side effects.
The good side effects. Okay, then I stop it here.
Yeah, thank you, Martin, and I will take this bridge to introduce myself. I am Beata Balogová. I am the editor-in-chief of Daily SME in Slovakia, independent daily, and I'm also a member of the board of the IPI. And I have one reaction, that I am ethnic Hungarian, so I read the Hungarian press, and I did notice what you, Martin, just described, this extreme radicalization of the discourse, even in independent media. And I often wonder if this is ever reversible, because how you go back? If you push the limits of how you report about things and you really start shouting so that your voice is heard. But let's go now to Marius Dragomir, who is based in Budapest. He's the director of Center for Media, Data and Society at Central European University. And I will ask you, Marius, to describe us how this captured media empire crosses borders, how it impacts, let's say, the Hungarian minority in neighboring countries. I have the information that Viktor Orban is really pouring massive investments into Hungarian language media. So what it does to the whole region, in your opinion?
Yes, sure. This is an extremely important question, and there has been some. The phenomenon has been documented in the past few years. But if you ask me precisely about the impact of the spread of the capture phenomenon across the borders, I think indeed it had. I would refer to four main types of impact on the media. And here, just before I start, I just want to re-emphasize the fact that the companies, some companies in Hungary affiliated with the government and oligarchs, in the past few years, they started to buy media outlets in other countries, in the Balkans, in Romania, and so on, just to give you an idea of the phenomenon. So back to the impact, I think first, there is definitely the spread of the model and the spread of the influence of the Fidesz media from Hungary in the region has a negative impact on the freedom of expression, because it exports with them a model where journalists are tied and they have to follow a certain editorial line. And this is something that we have seen across the region. In more specialized terms, scholars call that instrumentalization, which is the process where the media outlets are not being in business to do their job, but they exist to support the interests of various groups of interests. So this is one thing. The second impact that we have noticed is the impact at economic level. And again, this is something that has to do a lot with how Orban's media in Hungary operated over the past decade. The fact that the government has spent enormous amounts of money on public media, of course, with the goal of controlling it. The fact that the government increased the the advertising spending, also as a tool to control the media in Hungary. The fact that companies affiliated and associated with the government have bought private media in Hungary also had a massive economic impact, because what you notice here is an unprecedented increase in not only like ownership concentration but also financial capacity. And we have learned here what that means for the actual job of journalists. So at the economic level, that's also bad, because these companies are spreading the model, but they are also spreading quite hefty investments in the media that are not there to be independent across the region. So and that's an impact that I think we will see, whose implications we will notice even more in the future. The third type of impact I can think of is the political impact. And if you look at what happened in the region, yes, some of the investments that Hungarian oligarchs made in the media in the Balkans, for example, were due to the political affiliations of the parties in Hungary with their friends in Macedonia, for example. They offered each other, not each other yet, but the Hungarians offered political asylum and all that. But on the other hand, the investments in the region were also due to the fact that they are targeted to the Hungarian minority in some of these countries. Many of you probably know that, for example, the Hungarians, the ethnic Hungarians living in Romania, they have passports, they can vote in the Hungarian elections, and they read Hungarian language media in Romania. So these media outlets have been the target of these investments, and again, that's a very important impact. And I call it political because it is tightly linked with the elections. And as you have noticed, there have been some studies carried out by experts in Hungary. The closer to the elections you are, the more investments by the governments you see in the media, in media projects, and all that. And finally is what we call the ideological impact, and that has to do simply with the content that this media propagate, the values that they propagate. I won't insist on that. I guess you all know what we see in the media, and this is something that we have seen in Hungary and we see now in the media that are controlled by oligarchs. That's very important because that's the last step of the investment. That's actually what people consume, what people read, what people watch on television. So now, these are, in my view, the four sets of implications of the expansion of the capture. You choose what is the worst.
Thank you, Marius, for the excellent explanation, actually, and maybe it's not even an exaggeration to say that it is a type of illiberal colonization, because already in Slovakia or in Romania, you have communities where children go to kindergarten supported by Orban, they go to school supported by Orban, their parents listen entirely to media that is captured by Orban. They play football at sports clubs supported by Orban, and you can imagine the implications for those communities. But let's move to Poland, and we have Pavel Lavinsky, the deputy editor-in-chief of Onet, a journalist with 30 years of experience, which is itself a value. And I don't think that the Kaczynskis needed much inspiration from Orban, but really, if you look at Polish developments, we can see certain similarities with Hungary. Pavel, would you be so kind to explain us what the similarities are, but what are the most recent capture and impact on the still remaining independent media in Poland?
As you know, Kaczynski's love to Orban and fascination about his political way and what he did with the media in Hungary was a long story we knew many years ago, before he won the election with his Law and Justice party. So he is inspired definitely by Orban, and the plan was going like that. First, in 2-3 weeks after the election, he fired, the Justice and Law and Justice Party fired over 400 journalists and editors from state TV. I mean, use it at the moment state TV, not public TV, because it is not public anymore. It's absolutely the ruling party TV. As well with the radio stations, again, state radio stations. So he removed everything what was not in line with his party. So the same as my colleagues from Hungary say, he pumps a lot of money in Polish TV and radio. So he got the first goal because he has built a huge propaganda tube, which is in every city, small city and village in the country. Second move was to capture the local media, and he did it simply, very simple way. I mean, he changed the boards of all the state-owned company, I mean, huge companies, smaller also, and one of these companies, an oil giant, Orlen, bought the stake from the Polska Presse. So hundreds of local titles, regional titles, but most of all, 70 million of registered users and their profiles. So he got the insight to what those people are. And I think that this exactly will lead to and will influence the nearest situation in Poland, according to also free elections. I mean, free, but he might have, the ruling party might have the real full majority manipulating propaganda stake in the viewers, users, readers side. But it's not enough. The second step was to deal with the TVN news station belonged to American Discovery Channel, hated by the ruling party because they are very opposition medium, but absolutely clear, with absolutely clear message about the state of democracy and law in Poland. So they find out that their Polish license will not be released or prolonged anymore. It's still not sure what they will do. It's, I think, 9 days for the moment. TVN might lose this license, and more all, they try to pass a law in the parliament that will protect, that will make unavailable for the broadcasters, foreign broadcasters, to have their majority stake in media companies. Those broadcasters who broadcast from out of the European territory. So American-owned station, Polish station, might lose their business, simply. And one point I would also like to say in the end, because the plans of the ruling party and the goal is to win the election by any means. And what they, I don't know, we have 1 minute?
1 minute.
Okay. So, and the last concrete things were the lawsuits, or as we sometimes say, law attacks on media, which were critical for the ruling party and which did a lot of investigative reporting and find a lot of fraud, political fraud, money frauds. And we had, by the last 2 years, almost 200 lawsuits against media. So this is another way how they want to silence
Thank you.
us.
Thank you, Pavel. And maybe it's important to add one thing, that just like Kaczynski's, also Orban tried to mask this capture by suggesting that it is a clash, it's a cultural war, that it is a war between Christian conservatism and liberalism. And of course, Poland is more ideological, more authentically ideological, but in Hungary, Orban is purely technical, and he uses ideology just really as his power desires. But let's move to Bulgaria, and we have with us Boriana Jambazova. And as we spoke before the session, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, Bulgaria started, the Bulgarian authorities started capturing media much sooner than Orban got to power in Hungary. And yet, we don't speak that much about Bulgaria, so please use your time, your 5 minutes, to tell us as much as you can, so that we realize that there are many more islands of media capture than we imagine.
So how many hours do we have?
5 minutes.
I know. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, basically Bulgaria has remained under the radar, even though it shares a lot of the problems plaguing, Hungarian and Polish media that my fellow journalists just outlined. And in a way, we don't need export of media capture. We don't need to have Orban buy media in Bulgaria, because the domestic oligarchs basically did a pretty good job controlling the media themselves. As Beate already mentioned, in a way, chronologically, it happened before Orban took over in Hungary in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. But yes, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, basically, to know that if you control the media, then you can influence public opinion, you can win elections, etc. So one of the main problems plaguing the Bulgarian media landscape is related to lack of transparency when it comes to media ownership. For a long time, we had this media oligarch who publicly was declining that he owns any newspaper, etc. It was actually his mother for a long time, and then a very public feud force him to admit the ownership of those publications. But unlike Hungary, where the government, the state is controlling the media, in Bulgaria you have one prominent media mogul who has a bunch of, or used to now, a bunch of publications. So he's a power broker of sorts. So it doesn't matter in a way who is in government as far as he can sell or offer friendly coverage, of course, in exchange of other political or economic favors. The same attacks that we see in Poland and in Hungary when it comes to independent journalists, it's all happening in Bulgaria as well. Every critical voice who is, daring to raise their criticism publicly has been attacked. Smear campaigns now have been the norm for years, and they include, activists, the civil society, but also investigative and independent journalists. They've been framed and labeled as, enemies of the people, mercenaries of Soros. So, the rhetoric that we hear across the region, unfortunately. And in general, over the course of this, more than the past decade, we basically have seen this tabloid-style journalism basically dominating the media industry, a lot of hate speech, again, not just against minorities, but also reporters, publishers that are deemed as inconvenient or, let's say, dangerous to the government and the state. And for me, actually, one of the biggest damage that this has done to journalism in the country is erosion of trust. Basically, according to recent surveys, only 10% of Bulgarians think that media in the country is independent, and I don't blame them. Sometimes I'm embarrassed to introduce myself as a journalist because now this is associated with this sensationalist tabloid-style journalism that, of course, I don't want to subscribe to, but that's what people are thinking about sometimes when you say that you're a reporter. This has even much harder impact on regional media. So the struggles of the very few regional journalists who are practicing journalism outside of the capital city of Sofia are even bigger, because this ties between politicians and businessmen in a small town are much tighter. And especially if you want to do investigative journalism, the pressure that you're facing is greater. So it's very brave to again to work as a reporter in the small towns, and regional media has been more vulnerable and susceptible to this kind of media capture that we see on national level as well. So in a way, you don't need to shut down a publication or threaten to fire the editor-in-chief, as we've seen with Index that Marton mentioned earlier, because you can just buy friendly coverage. And this led to a sort of self-censorship and censorship in general, that many reporters know that there are certain people or certain topics that shouldn't be touched, or we should report on certain issues in a certain way. And over the years, several surveys that the Association of European Journalists in Bulgaria, which I'm a member of, have done, show that political and economic pressure has been increased. And I'll wrap it up here.
Thank you so much. And you made a very important point that there are really countries where autocrats don't even need to jail journalists any longer, because the system is deformed in a way that they are marginalized by the structure of the media market. And this is happening in your countries. And I'm amazed that the Soros argument is basically exported, even as we heard in a previous panel, to Asia. And it's completely an Orban product. But let's move to another very important question, that in any country where you don't operate under normal circumstances, in a deformed media environment, the definitions of independence really change. So you find yourself in needing to defend the rule of law and press freedom. On the other hand, you still need to navigate the fact that you are not an activist, that you are a journalist. And we have spoken with Marton so much about this. And so now let's share with the audience that you have already told me about it. How do you navigate this situation?
I think our readers have decided this question, and I see the same with 444 and Telex. So the Hungarian market, we see a few outlets which try to turn to a digital subscription model or donation model. And as I said, there were quite a few media outlets being shut down this 4 years again. But as a positive side effect, a part of the Hungarian leadership has understood that without financing free media, they won't have any. And an even better, I think an even better message from the reader is that they want fair and balanced news. So this is what I get from the numbers of Telex, 444 and HVG. They are not turning towards the sites which are, only having sensational reporting and opinion writing. They turn to the sites which say that we want to somehow balance out the fact that there is no independent news agency in Hungary anymore.
But I also imagine that if you have such situation and you have the opposition, and maybe in such situation, opposition politicians or they might feel that they need their own media, and they feel that you are supposed to support and help them in their fight.
They do, but we don't listen. But there are a smaller and smaller number of teams which can afford that. So that's the constant struggle, that the propaganda outlets, the number of propaganda outlets are growing. The circumstances of the independent is difficult. So there's I would say a gray area where some publications act independent, but at the same time take government advertisement, and there are a few independent left. But it is a really big, debate within the profession, because yes, we can be proud that our subscription models and donation models do work in some cases. But with that, you serve an even smaller part of the population as it should be served. And public media was once meant to get fair and balanced and quality news to those who can't afford to buy their preferred media outlets. Now it's a huge debate within our newsrooms that we produce fair news, but at the same time we are more and more likely to ask money for it, to put it behind a paywall. So how will a Hungarian citizen make in April an educated vote if he can't or she can't access fair and balanced news? So this is a big question.
And Boriana, how do you handle like this basically dilemma? And I know I have had a lot of talk about this with American journalists who really face this under the rule of Donald Trump. Like, okay, what does it mean to be independent when you are facing Trump at the press conference?
Yeah, when Trump took over, I was joking that, now in the White House, the Americans are going to witness what we've been experiencing for 30 years in the Balkans and have a taste of it. But yeah, it's very difficult to navigate, as you said, this deformed and kind of polluted media environment. And Bulgaria is the poorest EU member state. So unfortunately, of course, I wish people will pay for good journalism, but I think it's been an uphill battle to convince them that, media freedom and good journalism, it's worth paying for. And again, I cannot blame them, because sometimes when you cannot afford next month's rent or whatever, journalism is really low on your agenda. But basically, some of the media outlets, their ad revenues are shrinking. So they've been looking to alternatives philanthropy. They've been experimenting, as you pointed, with subscription models and other forms of different projects sponsored by grants. But of course, this makes them vulnerable to attacks of saying that you're independent. For me, I guess the best thing is just to do your job and provide good public journalism. But of course, that's a challenge.
I'm actually very happy, because in one question we are also addressing the model of financing media, and as well as the question of independence. Marius, I have heard the argument from Hungary that in an environment where the idea of the division of power is completely killed, that activism and journalists are allowed to cross the line until it is restored, like the turning stage of politics. But again, the question, is there a way back, or how do you see the situation? Do the fundamentals of journalism change in an autocratic society?
Well, they do, but they shouldn't, I think. They do, but they shouldn't. Whatever the environment is, and however captured the environment is, I think it's really important to not respond in terms of the coverage and the editorial work in the same measure. And this is something that HVG is doing well. When you see Hungary, and Hungary is probably surely the most concentrated and captured environment in Europe. When you have such a situation, the tendency of those supporting independent media is to go support or open independent media that are oppositional to the government. That's a normal reaction, and that is the reaction that is triggered and prompted by this very powerful government. If we want to support journalism, we have to support media outlets that are against the government. In a way, that is, it's important to have that as well, because you don't have any investigations of what is happening at the government level in Hungary unless you have these independent investigative outlets. But on a longer term, I think this is very damaging for the overall quality of journalism, because it only increases polarization. You have Orban media and the opposition media, and people, slowly they actually forget what is, to have independent journalism. And so I think on a longer term is bad. Of course, it's okay to cross that line sometimes, especially when you have really difficult environment. But overall, I think the damage to the profession by doing only that is huge on a longer term. I think you have to stick to journalism and support that and show people what actually means to be editorially independent.
It is actually interesting that this question sometimes raises in the most unexpected situation. For example, when our colleague Jan Kuciak was killed, suddenly we found ourselves in a situation that am I supposed to go to a square and deliver a speech to people? You know, am I supposed to call on the government to resign, or am I supposed to call on the government to investigate on the stage, other than writing my editorials and criticizing them in the newspaper? So I imagine that operating in such a deformed environment brings up so many issues that journalists in an environment where at least power balance is set don't face. Pavel, what do you think about this? How you navigate this very sensitive area in Poland?
I would start with Belarus, in fact, because we talk about really difficult situation, but what we face in Visegrad countries, we face a threat for media, but done in a kind of institutional way by the governments and by changing the laws. And this is a little bit different, because when I look what happened in Belarus, how many journalists were jailed, beaten, the suffer of their families and other society which were closed in jails, those who came out. So I think that this is a critical situation that might be something like a kind of excuse. This is revolution in the street. There are people dying also. But when we talk about the situation like change the journalism for activism, I wouldn't be so happy if my journalists would demonstrate in the streets, for example. They should just report and ask for comments and explain to the readers what threats some kind of politics might occur. So I do not have better answer at the moment.
But that's a very important answer, because I also believe that journalistic standards should be put ahead anything, because once you cross the line, it's very difficult to go back. Like, it might take really many years to repair, and maybe the next generation of journalists just won't remember them. And I think you made an important point. We are also quite lucky, because the first question from the audience matches the question that I meant to ask anyway. And it's not that I am trying to squeeze out some optimism from this panel, because it's almost an impossible task, but let's talk a little bit about what really works, and what are the practices that you find working even in such a deformed environment. And maybe Marton, what over those years, since I know you, it's maybe 5 years, like you are going on and you are doing your journalism, what works? What do you think is something that all the independent media outlets can agree on, and how you do it?
Well, there's the belief that our work really matters, that we make a difference. So this is surely a thing what we tell each other. You have to be stupid or idealistic to work for the Hungarian media. And there are times where I feel that I'm stupid, other times I'm idealistic. And on the other side, we still have very good journalists, and we have very good competitors. So it can be fun to work for the Hungarian media, and sometimes, you know, just make yourself clear that nothing, that the world is not only, you know, circling around Mr. Orbán. So you have a much broader task to report on life and life's matters and the challenges, and actually the challenges the world face are even bigger than Mr. Orbán, although he seems not to understand that.
Boriana, what works for you? Or what are the practices you would feel that keep journalistic standards safe?
I mean, that's $1 million question, but yeah, unfortunately, in Bulgaria, I guess there aren't that many positive news, but it's good. A couple of years ago, there was this major investigation that was dubbed as Apartment Gate, and that basically revealed you know, politicians and government officials owning, you know, luxurious villas or apartments, some of them actually funded with EU money. And it started with one outlet, but then others, you know, even competitors jumped into the story and picked it up and developed it and started digging deeper. So I feel like sometimes this sense of community and actually working together, even if we don't belong to the same newsroom, but like sharing the same values and subscribing like to the principles of good journalism, like helps. There are, you know, some new media outlets trying to experiment with like ad-free, entirely supported by their readers. Of course, these are small newsrooms, so it's not, we're not talking about like 50 or, you know, more reporters, but still seeing this kind of budding projects, I think it's reassuring sometimes.
I actually observed that in Slovakia, solidarity between independent media also help. That if there is a breaking story, strong anti-corruption story, we tend to share the story and we tend to monitor others' work. How is it in Poland, Pavel?
I believe, answering your previous question, which is pretty much the same, I would say if what we can do, I think do our job as best as we can. Do not hang up and have a good lawyers. This is the first. But what you are saying now, I mean, showing solidarity as a really great power, I hope. And what happened in Poland, we had two really big journalistic actions. First was this against the Lex TVN, and one of the journalists from Gazeta Wyborcza Daily started a big protest, and over 1,000 journalists from around the country signed it, and most bigger and smaller media. I don't know if politically it was recognized by the law and justice, but it was really a big thing. The second, what happened a week ago, 40 media outlets signed documents an appeal against the emergency state proclaimed by the governments on the Polish-Belarusian border, forbidding journalists to cover the events inside the territory. And again, we said that we are not going to stop reporting because this is our job, simple job. And some constitutional experts say that this is unconstitutional under the emergency state to forbid journalists to get into. So those two concrete things about solidarity.
Thank you. Marius, we will check your ability to be brief.
I just want to mention, I think all these things are very important, but when you speak about capture, I think it's very important to keep in mind that this is not a thing that happens in 1 year. This is built over more than a decade in Hungary. So the answer to your question, I think, has to be a bit more nuanced. If it's in the early stage, and we have written a lot about that with the hope that people will read and keep in mind that I think if you are in the early stage, the most important thing is to mobilize civil society to react against various legal developments that happened in Hungary 10 years ago when nobody believed at the time that we would get here. So that's one thing, and probably I'm not saying it's easier, but it's something that has to be done. If it's later, as we are now in kind of an impossible situation, things are more difficult. One, of course, is to do your job and to do your job well. But I think, in a way, what is important to do is to really think about those in power as a competitor, and a very powerful competitor that has access to funding and that has access to rule making, which is really powerful. And if you keep that in mind, I think various things have to be done. In some ways, you can and you should imitate them. Because what is happening in Hungary, they brought all the media outlets under Kesma. They created a huge mammoth, media mammoth, and this is something that is very damaging for media freedom. That kind of action can be done also at the independent journalism level. Solidarity is one thing. Trying to find ways, not merging everything into one body, but trying to find ways to act together. The second thing would be to think more about ways to attract the private sector, not only in spending advertising, but this is an audience that is powerful. Sometimes it is captured itself by the government. And the third way is to think about platforms. Generations are changing, consuming media in different ways, and identifying the places where the government hasn't occupied yet is another option.
Thank you so much. We can take one question from the audience, if there is any. Everybody is sleepy after the lunch. Oh, yeah. Please, Johannes.
From German television, ZDF, and I always find it fascinating. I want to make a short remark. We are Europeans, right? All of us. We live in the European Union. It's always fascinating to see how different the universes are in which we are in. If I listen to you, and when we are talking about state media and mainstream media, it means something completely different than in our German context. So it's exactly the opposite around. So my question is, from your perspective, what did we get wrong? Because what happened to you is an attack on the heart of our European value system in a way. So what did the European Union, what did we get wrong in understanding what is going on in your countries? And what would you expect? Now we have elections in Germany very soon. And what would you expect the European Union or even your German government, how to address this attack on our, let's say, common value system, which we see happening in Hungary, Bulgaria, and Poland?
Who would like to answer the question?
Maybe I will answer shortly. just push your governments, to push your Brussels people to do something more spectacular than Brussels and European Union done already. I know we have support in a way. Vera Jourova also said it clearly today, but I think the problem with our governments, actual governments, is that they don't care much about that. And I think diplomacy, but sharp diplomacy, is very important.
Yes?
Well, maybe if I could just add, I think for a long time, Western Europe or the European Union has been turning a blind eye to media freedom. We were talking about some colleagues earlier, and media is not a commodity. It's a public service, and I think for a while politicians were failing to understand, this basically connection, or at least they were addressing it, between media freedom and rule of law and, corruption and state capture in general. I mean, what we witnessed in Hungary, Hungarian journalists were raising the alarm for years, but basically nobody listened until it was way too late and they reached the point of no return. So as Marius pointed earlier, now it's much difficult to reverse that process. And that's why I think it's important to discuss these issues, because let's say Bulgaria is not quite there yet, but if there aren't any measures, fewer things could be done in the future.
Yeah, perhaps I was hesitant to answer is because in 2014, now 7 years ago, that time biggest Hungarian news portal, Origo, was turned to the dark side. The editor-in-chief was fired by the firm belonging to Deutsche Telekom. So Hungarian journalists tried to make noise. They tried to get the message through that here a German investor was playing alongside with the Hungarian government and helped to take out the first major newsroom. That was a huge blow. And then 2 years later, 2016, in the wake of a business Axel Springer wanted to do, Népszabadság, at that time leading newspaper, was shut down. We were invited by Martin Schulz to the European Parliament. We went, we told a lot of things, and 2 years ago, Angela Merkel was visiting Orbán in Sopron, and she told that European money was well spent by Orbán in the last 9 years. So this has been, the years we've learned not to really expect anything from the European Union or from Germany. This is a struggle where we have to do it ourselves. This is the feeling. I given up on having advice.
Yeah, and I think that what my colleagues are saying and what I feel, that very often diplomatic interests overpower our own values. And we heard it before, for example, from the OECD, that autocrats don't listen. But I believe that such organizations are not supposed to talk only to autocrats, because their authority is ultimately also backed by the power of the public. And if there are couple journalists still remaining in those countries doing their job, do it for themselves. And very often there is no other way just to really say how it is and not to allow these autocrats to go home and tell to their public that, oh, it's done, we won. And I think the main message of this panel, and thank you so much, Marton, Boriana, Marius, and Pavel, to help to get the message through that what is happening in these countries affects the whole European Union, because the press freedom of the European Union is just as weak or strong as in these countries, and ultimately, like, other countries might just say, like, who are you to criticize us, let's say in Asia or in Africa, for trampling the press, if, you know, countries who call themselves democratic themselves are not able to protect it. And so thank you so much. Thank you for IPI to pay attention to the Central European region and the Visegrad region. It's very valuable for all the journalists. Thank you.